welcome everyone. I hope you all can hear me in the back. I have a microphone, but it's for the recording, not for volume. At the last minute, we had to move to a smaller room, so I realized we're very crowded in here. So thank you for your patience and squeezing around the corners of the room. We're very excited to have all of you here today for what is our second Union on the Hill event. We hosted our first congressional orientation on faith and governance in January, where we took a bird's eye view of the relationship between discussions about church and state, in contrast to discussions about faith and politics, and looked at the difference it makes in how you frame the issues and the kind of great conversation you can stimulate when theological reflection and political involvement come together. We're going to be doing these things regularly and have a continued presence here, working with our many friends and partners in D.C., and it represents Union's long-standing commitment as a theological seminary to bring its work to bear on the most pressing issues facing our country today, and to explore these from a progressive theological angle, from a moral angle, from an always interfaith and interreligious angle, and from an angle which includes our secular and our spiritual but not religious brothers and sisters. So today we gather at a crucial moment in our nation's history, in a country that has thankfully grown far more accepting of our multiple identities as a nation, and especially of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. All over the country, we are seeing new attacks crop up, attacks that strike at the fundamental rights of not only the LGBTQ community, again, but of many of the most vulnerable Americans. This includes, as we've seen, using religion to deny things like basic reproductive health care services to women, jeopardizing public health and safety, coercing working people to follow beliefs not their own, and the list goes on. Now let me be clear about this discussion today. Religious freedom is a core American value, one that is cherished by Americans across all religious affiliations and no religious affiliation. This freedom has allowed, over the centuries, Americans to practice the religion of their choice by freely gathering in worshiping communities and to live out their faith without fear of oppression or discrimination. This is crucial. But this freedom was never intended as a license to discriminate. And the laws that we've seen in Arkansas and Indiana stand in direct opposition to our country becoming a more just, loving, inclusive, indeed, in all these ways, a more perfect union. What we need is a more inclusive constitutional vision of what robust religious freedom in America looks like going forward. And this is what we're here to discuss today. Let me just add that yesterday morning I returned from a 10-day trip to Iran, which is an example, quite an amazing place, but an example of what happens when religious values are allowed to override basic constitutional respect for human rights. For many Christians, myself included, constitutional protections of rights and the refusal of harm is also a deeply held religious value. Welcome.
How you doing, man?
Yes, good to see you. Welcome, welcome. We've been saying all sorts of things about you before you got here. From our perspective, it is not a religious freedom on the one side of the issue and constitutional rights on the other side of the issue. On both scores, there are theological and moral grounds for respecting and indeed enhancing their mutually complementary protections. So to start off, I am going to introduce from the Center of American Progress their VP for Legal Progress, Michelle Jawanda, who's going to frame the issues for us from, not from a faith perspective, we're going to be coming back to that, but from a legal perspective to frame the big picture for us. So, Michelle?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So this is an amazing turnout. As a former Hill staffer, we would often kind of get the smaller room so we could tell everybody how our room was overflowing. So this is a great turnout. We at the Center for American Progress are really appreciative of Union for taking the lead on talking about these issues at the intersection of both policy and faith. Our own CAP Faith team and Union have worked on issues together in the past, and now I'm really excited that Legal Progress and our team are continuing to do that. I also want to just extend our greetings on behalf of our President Neera Tanden to the Congressmen and everyone at CAP for the leadership you both show on so many issues. So really, thank you. So from the founding, really, of our nation, religious freedom has always been a cherished and protected value. It is part of the core of who we are. And courts and legislatures have always had this challenge to find the balance between these two components of religious freedom: the right to worship and practice one's faith, and the right not to be coerced into following beliefs that are not one's own. And striking that right balance has always required a certain attention and respect for the vibrant plurality of our beliefs and diverse practices here in America. I think, unfortunately, most observers would say that balance was really upset in 2014 when the Supreme Court in Hobby Lobby versus Burwell ruled that certain for-profit corporations are protected by the Religious Freedom Act. The court held, and let me say this exactly, the court held that religious beliefs of corporate owners trumped the religious freedom and health care needs of their employees. What we saw as the 5-justice conservative majority ruled that corporations' religious liberties were violated by the Affordable Care Act's requirement that contraceptive coverage be included with other preventative health care. This was the first time we've ever seen kind of this upset balance as we've looked at issues of religious liberty. But the implications of that case really went far beyond the health care reform bill. Since this decision, we've seen all over this nation certain individuals, and sometimes they happen to be conservatives, and I don't want to kind of give the whole bucket saying that all conservatives fall in this, but we've seen efforts for those who are opposed to marriage equality or issues around reproductive justice, frequently asserting religious freedom as an excuse to discriminate against same-sex couples and others. And we've seen legislators introduce several religious freedom bills and expand religious liberties far beyond current law and extend protections to for-profit corporations. But if we think about it, these bills really are not about religious freedom. What they are about forcing business owners' beliefs on the general public, you and I, even in places where non-discrimination laws protect same-sex couples. If some of this sounds familiar, it is because we've seen kind of this playbook play out at a very different time, but also a struggle here in this country. It's because many of these responses were offered in response to civil rights legislation. What we saw is, at the time, business owners who were upset with the Supreme Court striking down segregation as the law of the land, trying to move forward with religious exemptions. However, many of those religious exemptions were not granted for good reason. The Warren Court and others saw that such exemptions would simply cloak bigotry underneath the veil of morality and conscience. And so as a country, we rejected the same reasons to extend those religious exemptions. You know, states have been adopting their own religious freedom acts for years, but until recently, the statutes did not seek such a radical transformation of religious freedom. These bills make it easier for businesses and individuals to opt out of laws that protect the rights of others. You know, as we think about what's happening now, the Supreme Court this month will rule on marriage equality. And it's no coincidence that we see that many of these religious exemption bills are moving forward just as the court is considering whether to uphold, underneath the Equal Protection Clause, marriage equality for all. You know, our panel is going to address many of these issues today. We'll talk about the proliferation of state religious freedom acts. We'll talk about what's happened in Indiana. And in the wake of what's coming down in a few weeks with the Supreme Court, what that will mean for you and I. One of the things that I would like to highlight is that RFRA and its original intent and purpose, these religious freedom acts, were safeguards for religious minorities. And Serene just talked about her recent trip to Iran. RFRAs were originally intended to provide protections for those who lacked voice and support from the majority religion. That was the initial purpose. And if those protections are repackaged to have a different meaning, then they become unreliable and leave minority religious communities at a higher risk of discrimination. So in a post-9/11 world, Muslim and Sikh communities fall victim to discrimination from many different angles, from school admissions to employment to even last week receiving a can of soda on a plane. And we owe it to these communities and others at this critical moment to preserve the initial intent behind religious liberty. We cannot allow religious liberty to be used to justify discrimination. And as we all know, religious freedom is, again, a core American value, and one that progressives, and I'm proud to say, progressives highly value. I come from a generation, I'm a third generation woman of faith. Religious liberty and religious beliefs are something that progressives value. And today we hope to shed some light on this and set out in the days and weeks to come what an inclusive vision of religious freedom really looks like. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and each one of them will speak for a couple of minutes, and then we'll have the panelists talk to each other for a few minutes, but we really want to save time for questions from the group gathered here, so we're going to keep this moving quickly. So first, I would like to thank him for his participation. Our congressional sponsor, Representative Keith Ellison of Minnesota. Yes. Who, among many, many things, is the first Muslim member of Congress and someone who has a deep understanding of the economic ramifications of destructive religious freedom legislation. We are also very happy to have with us Representative Andre Carson of Indiana. And no one has seen more firsthand what can go wrong in the wake of bad religious freedom bills. We're also very happy to have with us Sally Steenland of the Center for American Progress. And she's going to bring us up to date on what's going on in the broad faith movement. And then we also have my friend and colleague, who is the Executive Vice President at Union and a Presbyterian minister, Fred Davey. So, Representative Ellison, I'm going to start with you. And
well, would it help if I stood up, or?
I think you should stand up,
okay,
because I don't think in the back people sitting.
Well, we want to look at everybody.
And this is not for volume, but it's for the
for the thingamajig.
recording. So people know.
Well, Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with this arrangement, there would never be cause for such as these marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix. And those are the words of the trial judge, January 6, 1959, and the Lovings, and you all know the case, pled guilty because they were guilty. One was white, or at least that's what we call what the husband was. That's his racial category assignment. And one was black. That was her racial category assignment. And it was illegal for them to be married to each other. And they were sentenced to a year in prison, with the sentence suspended for 25 years on the condition that they get out of the state that they were born in, Virginia, and they moved to this place here, D.C. And so that's how religion can go wrong in government, right? Remember, all these bigotries, and I think, Michelle, you made an excellent point by saying that, when people want to discriminate, religion is a great cloak to run behind. And I can tell you, and Andre deal with this every day. I'm the first Muslim elected to Congress, but I'm not the last one. This is the Muslim caucus right here. And I can assure you that a lot of people in our faith use religion to work out their women hating, their gay hating, to work out their all kinds. And we ain't bragging about them, but they're there, and every faith has them. People who use the faith to push their private, selfish, evil, violent agenda. Let me also throw you another quote, because I think another quote is warranted. It goes back again to the founding. Because while these founding fathers did a whole lot of really ugly things on race and gender and Native Americans, here's something that they kind of got a little bit right. See if you remember this guy. Of all the animosities which have existed among mankind, those which are caused by a difference of sentiments in religion appear to be the most inveterate and distressing and ought to be deprecated. That's George Washington. Now, he's like the founder of the country, right? Or one of them. So, now in the Constitution, the only place we mention religion is saying that it's not supposed to be part of our civic rights, right? We in the first clause of the First Amendment, it said Congress shall make no law establishing religion, nor abridge the free exercise thereof. Later on, it says there shall be no religious test. That's how come me and Andre get to be in Congress. There shall be no religious test for serving in public office. So the very origins of religion, right, and religious protections are to keep the government from exploiting the pastor, the preacher, the rabbi, the imam, because governments always want to grab religion and use it to cloak their actions. So we said you cannot do that in the United States. There's a separation. So again, we are at a point where people want to discriminate. They want to work out their anti-gay sentiments, their anti-Muslim stuff, their anti-woman stuff. They want to work it out, and they want to use religion to do it. And that is what's happening. Religious rights are for the individual person, not for the government, and certainly not for some corporate entity. So the question, and I'm going to close with this, the real question, we all know that. I could have not said it, you know it already. My point is, the real question is political will and organization. And I'm telling you that a disorganized, underfunded majority gets beat by a well-funded, organized minority. But a well-funded, well-organized majority beats any minority. So the question is, what are we, the majority who believe in religious liberty, going to do about it? We've got to be active, we got to be engaged, and we got to make this a part of what we fight for when we fight for that concept embodied in the idea of liberty and justice for, come on now, this is audience participation. Liberty and justice for all. If it's for all, there are no exceptions, right? And so that's what we're fighting for. What they're fighting for is liberty and justice for all, except everybody we don't like. And what we're fighting for is all, period, dot, end of conversation. So the thing is, it's a political will issue. And let me just wrap with this. Since 2008, we have lost 910 state legislators. I'm talking about Democrats. We're down to 18 governors. And here's the real kicker. Voting participation got down to 36% last election. Last November, 36% of people voted, 72-year low. And if we let that continue to happen, we're going to get this RFRA nonsense. And these people who believe in a discriminatory, exclusive America, their electoral success goes up as the electorate shrinks. But if they want to shrink it, we better do what? Expand it. We got to prioritize turnout, field campaigns, which is face-to-face door knocking, and we've got to operate in a collaborative manner between federal, state, city. Neither Andre nor I nor any member of Congress writes the districts that we run in, nor do we set the qualifications for the voters who we ask to vote for us. We can't decide same-day voter registration like we have in Minnesota. That's a state thing. We cannot decide vote by mail like they got in Oregon. We cannot decide whether felons get to vote or not. But the state can, and any member of Congress not collaborating with the states is crazy. And I'll say that to anybody. We have got to get a state, federal, city, led by the community, led by faith leaders like this awesome person right here, Serene Jones. This is what we got to do. And this is really truly my last word. Forgive me for talking so long, Serene. But Serene and I got to know each other on the bus in Selma. And it was such a joy to get to meet you, but also get to meet you that way. Because it means that we have this shared spirit, forged in places like Selma. And you know what? If those people like Jimmy Lee Jackson and could make a way for us, then what is our responsibility in this moment, at this time? So let's go correct this thing.
Right. Wow. What did he say after Keith? He said it all. No. Always a pleasure. I certainly want to thank Sally and Dr. Serene Jones and Fred and Michelle and Brother Ellison and Karen and each and every one of you for taking your time out to come, because I think that this is an important discussion. In the great Hoosier state, we don't have as many lakes as Keith does. And we don't even have, I told Keith when I go to Minnesota, I need to go to Lake Minnetonka just because of Purple Rain Prince. But earlier this year I was deeply saddened because of RFRA. And I think in Indiana, we do have a very dark history in many ways, once the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. But also, Indiana was critical in the Underground Railroad movement. And for politicians to use RFRA as a means to possibly expand their national profile, to speak to an already hostile political base, I think it set our state back, and I think it opened up an important dialogue. Now, the shining part of RFRA is that there are over 11 municipalities, and Dr. Reverend Angelique Walker is back there from Indiana. There are currently 11 or 12 municipalities that have protections from RFRA. And that's simply because their local city councils passed ordinances that specified protections for LGBTQ couples. And the downside is that in this whole debate, those municipalities did not get the credit that they deserve. They just focused on our governor and they focused on our legislature. And as we approach the weekend, I'll be participating in our annual Pride Parade. It's one of the largest Pride Parades in the country, in Indiana of all places. And my hope is that the faith community, to Keith's point, can have a larger dialogue about what it means when we talk about our common themes. So we know that the Abrahamic faiths share a common theme, and we know that the other faiths share a common theme. And I believe that common theme or that common thread is what we know as the golden rule. Doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so, as human beings who vary in hue, as was mentioned, and color, we're all carbon-based. But we're responsible for this shared enterprise. It's called the government. And we talk about the Constitutional Convention and Ben Franklin talking about having a republic or a monarchy. We have republic if you can keep it. We keep the republic by having these kinds of conversations. So I want to thank you for letting me participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Sally Steenland. Thanks, Serene. Thanks, Union. And thanks both Congressmen Ellison. We worked with you on anti-Muslim bigotry over the years, and that was wonderful work, and with Congressman Carson, too. Not long ago, I was at a conference, and I heard the evangelical pastor, Rick Warren, say that religious freedom is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And then he said, whichever side wins the public debate on religious freedom will win everything else. So laws, policies, everything else will fall into place if you win the public debate. Well, now, it's probably pretty clear I disagree with Rick Warren on many things, but on this we actually do agree. And what that means is the next 12 to 24 months are very crucial in this public debate. Whichever side gets to frame what religious freedom is, not as a partisan weapon, but as a core American value, will win people's hearts and minds. And that is one reason why it's crucial for progressives to claim religious freedom as a value we cherish. We can't give it away. So it's strategically smart, but there's another reason we need to do this, which is it's true. We actually do cherish religious freedom. What we've seen in the past several months are state after state attempt to pass RFRAs, their own versions of Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. Now, the backlash to Indiana slowed things down a bit, but conservatives have promised they will be back in 2016. In Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, they'll be back having learned some lessons from Indiana. So we need to be ready, but beyond that, beyond being on the defensive and defeating state RFRAs, we need to take the offensive. We need to stand up and we need to speak out for our vision of religious freedom, what it is and what it isn't. So what does that mean? Well, a progressive vision of religious freedom is not opposed to women's reproductive health or marriage equality. They're not internally opposed to each other. Our vision of religious freedom is inclusive. It includes workers as well as the boss. I think it's really important to say that we believe in religious exemptions, because after Hobby Lobby, they've gotten a bad name. But there's different kinds of religious exemptions. So not religious exemptions that cause harm, discriminate, or impose unreasonable costs on others. And how can you tell the difference between the two? Well, recently we saw the Supreme Court decide that when a Muslim woman wears a hijab or a headscarf to work, that religious exercise doesn't harm other people. She's practicing her faith. When a Jewish man gets a kosher meal in prison, that doesn't harm other people. But when an employer forces his employees to abide by his or her religious beliefs, that's coercive, and that causes harm. And actually, in the case of Hobby Lobby, employees are literally paying the cost of their boss's beliefs because they're paying for their own contraception. When a baker or a florist wants to turn someone away just because of who they are, that causes harm. So these kinds of sweeping or overly broad religious exemptions, they cross the line. And what they do is they claim religion as a justification for imposing your beliefs on other people. And they actually go beyond that too. Here's a new thing that they're doing. So rather than me exercising my faith, what these new exemptions say is, I believe that your conduct is immoral, and if I don't stop your conduct, then I'm complicit in it. So I have to now go around finding people who do things that I think are wrong and stop it. That's a very, very different kind of religious exemption. And as other folks said, what our opponents are doing is they're using religious freedom to claim the high moral ground. And that's really no surprise. So if you say you're fighting for religious freedom, that sounds a whole lot better to say than you oppose birth control. It sounds a whole lot better than to say you're anti-marriage equality. And another thing our opponents are doing, and this is the victim card, which is really pretty can be pretty persuasive. And you hear words like persecution and oppression. And I've heard folks say religious freedom is hanging by a thread in this country. And we as conservatives and liberals in the Obama administration were, waging this unprecedented war on people of faith. And I actually heard people say this at a conference that was at the Four Seasons, which was like, how persecuted are you really? So. And then we all had lunch, with grilled asparagus. It was like crazy. So what we need to do is we need to dispute these claims, and especially faith leaders. And that's at the faith team at CAP what we do. We work with faith communities to reclaim religious liberty, to really complicate that narrative, to claim it for our side. So when faith leaders stand up for religious freedom and women's health and LGBT equality, then they show another side to the debate, and they really make it clear that you don't have to pick a side. You don't have to be for religious freedom or for civil and human rights. So when we have faith leaders who stand up for an inclusive vision of religious freedom, what they actually do is reflect the beliefs of millions of Americans, as you were saying, the majority, who do not want to see this cherished value turned into a partisan weapon. And besides that, there's a very practical, strategic, political goal, which is faith leaders give elected leaders the support to do the right thing. And I'll close with a story that illustrates this point. One of our colleagues is in Maine, one of our faith leaders, and he was at a hearing. Maine was considering a RFRA, and the Judiciary Committee was having a hearing. It was an hour long, 30 minutes for those supporting RFRA, 30 minutes for those opposed. So the first 30 minutes, those supporting it went, and they were mostly clergy, and they were mostly conservative. And then their time was up. And then it was time for those opposed. So our colleague, who is clergy and is wearing a collar, gets up to testify. And the chairman of the committee says, no, I'm sorry. We're now hearing from those opposed to RFRA. And the person says, wearing the clergy collar, I am opposed. And he says, no, the clergy already testified. We now need to hear. It took 3 times to unconfuse this chairman and to say, I am clergy and I do oppose RFRA. And after the hearing, they organized faith leaders to call the members of the committee and say why the bill was bad and why you should oppose it. And the bill died in committee. And afterwards, the lawmakers said they had wanted to vote against it, but that they really needed moral cover to do the right thing. And that's really, a strategic as well as a philosophical reason for do that. So as progressives, we need to engage people of faith on our side. And what we also need to do, whether we're religious or not, we need to talk about the values that ground our work. Not just numbers, not just charts, not just policies. We cannot be shy about claiming our moral compass. So we all have the facts on our side. We're all really, really smart, but the facts are not enough. They're never enough. Because if that's all we have, we leave a moral vacuum. And people want meaning. And when we leave that vacuum, what happens? Our opponents rush in, they fill the vacuum with their rhetoric, and then we're always playing defensive. So finally, as many people have said, you can say it with me, religious freedom should be a shield, not a sword. We all know that. And it's a value and that liberates us, that empowers us, and that unites us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Serene. Thank you, Congressman, for hosting this event. Thank you, Michelle. It's nice to join you today. So my name is Fred Davey. I am the Executive Vice President at Union Seminary. I'm a Presbyterian minister, but it's more complicated for me than that. I'm also married to Michael Adams. Michael and I got married 11 years ago, and we've been together for 17 years. I want to make 4 quick points that I hope will reinforce what we've already heard. Point number 1 is that I'm a person of faith. I've always been a person of faith. I grew up as a Presbyterian in North Carolina. My mother was a Presbyterian in North Carolina. My grandparents were Presbyterians, and my great-grandparents were Presbyterians in North Carolina. All the same little church, Love's Chapel Presbyterian Church in Belmont, North Carolina. Faith is extremely important to me. Faith has saved my life over and over and over again. And I do this as a progressive person, deeply rooted in my Presbyterianism, in Christianity, in my faith, that I hope is broad enough to include people who don't believe and see and understand the world as I see it. but a deeply rooted faith informs and guides and supports and sustains me in what I do. Faith has literally saved my life. Point number 2 is that RFRAs and other types of discrimination and bigotry is real, it's painful, it hurts, it's exclusive, it's oppressive. Now, I'm old enough to have remembered signs in Belmont, North Carolina, at the amusement park that said, "Tuesdays reserved for coloreds." And I remember in 1965, with a group of my neighborhood kids walking to that park and integrating that park and being ushered out by good, church-going law enforcement officers. People who use their faith to discriminate against me, a kid, who simply wanted to go to the amusement park on the basis of my race. And I feel the same degree of oppression coming from people who would use their faith to discriminate against me because I'm a gay man, or discriminate against me because I'm married. Point number 3, I am encouraged by the fact that there are people in all faiths who have held these positions, that faith somehow requires this level of discrimination and bigotry, and are changing their minds. It was wonderful for me to read yesterday that Tony Campolo, a prominent evangelical, conservative minister with a great following, has changed his mind on this issue. David Gushee, Dr. David Gushee, a graduate of Union Theological Seminary, who until about a year ago had also held the position that I, as a gay man, had no right to be married, and he held that position as a Christian. He has changed his mind, and he's written a book about his change of mind. I am happy to see that Mark Ochtermeyer, a New Testament scholar in the Midwest, has done the same. So it's encouraging to see that the winds of change are blowing, and they need to continue to blow, but they're blowing among people who have held a position of discrimination and oppression and bigotry, and they've seen the error of their ways, and they've come to that change of mind and heart by virtue of their faith. I am highly encouraged by that. Final point, and it is that I believe that there can be religious exemptions in some cases. But if we're going to exist in the public square, if we're going to exist with public accommodations, if we're going to have publicly funded projects and work, if we're going to have taxpayers' money involved in developing programs, if businesses are going to have the protection of the state in order to operate, then you can't tell me that I can't order a pizza or buy flowers or sit in a restaurant or have a Coke because of what I believe or who I love. That is not what a democracy is meant to be. A democracy can't last if that's how we choose to pursue it. So I am encouraged. I am happy. I have joy in my heart today that these leaders have chosen to, here on the Hill, Heart of Democracy, to, with Union Seminary, sponsor this hearing. And I have hope that we're going to get beyond this with a lot of work, and that people are going to be able to enjoy the freedoms that we're intended to enjoy, and that we will all really work to make sure that we have a more perfect union for all of us. So thank you very much.
So thank you. There's a lot there, all of you. I really, really appreciate your comments, your insights, and your commitment to changing this. And we're going to open it up for questions now. And if you could, in asking a question, Keep it to 2 sentences. We don't need little speeches, but we really want to hear from you and have a chance for our panelists to respond. And both of our congressmen are on a very short time frame, so they may need to leave, so let's get the questions going. So I see one right here. Yes. Uh-huh.
Should I stand up?
Yep. I think so people can hear.
Thank you all for coming. I just have just one quick question. I noticed a recurring theme in the presentation was that, it was an aversion to people who use religion to impose their views upon others. But just so I can be clear, so I can understand your position, doesn't everybody to an extent impose their view upon others? I mean, we all collectively, we kind of impose our views when someone says something extremely heinous. I mean, I'm just trying to find the ground of where you guys stand. Just curious.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I mean, I'll just take a quick crack at that. So I can try to convince you of anything. Oh, sorry. I can try to convince you of anything. So, and if I feel strongly about it, I hope I will convince you, and I would like to try to persuade you, and that's how a democracy works. And if somebody in the front row disagrees with me, so more speech. But what I can't do is pass a law to make you follow my belief. So in terms of private citizens and, free robust debate, that's all great. But that's how you win. And if you get enough people to vote for you, that's fine. But I can't then say, oh, well, I didn't persuade you, but I want you to do it anyway, so I'm going to force you to do it. I mean, that's just my take on it.
I think that's the proper way. I agree with her.
All right, another question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Another question. Yes. Uh-huh.
Dr. Gushing was one of my favorite professors at Mac.
Yeah.
My question is two-part. One, the coalition that you've had, Muslim coalition, have you had any other representatives come with you that agree on your stance, who they are? And number two, how do you separate the difference between the person that participates in a wedding and the person that makes a cake for a wedding? Meaning, hey, if I come to sing at your wedding, I'm a singer, it's different from a person that bakes a cake, you take the cake to the wedding. Is there a difference, and how do y'all discuss it?
You know what? I don't think that race and sexual orientation are perfectly interchangeable, but I think they sometimes are. And I think that if you can, if you're black and you walk into the bakery and say, I need a cake for a wedding, and if the person behind the counter and say, we don't serve blacks, then we would all agree you can't do that. But of course, we don't all agree you can't do that, but we all know what the law says you can't do that. Now, if you can't do that to a black person, you shouldn't be able to do that to a gay person or a woman or a Muslim. You should, so that's kind of how I draw the line on that. Now, you asked to think about the Muslim thing. Let me tell you, just about 2 weeks ago, this guy named Kurt Wilders, who is this famous hater of Muslims, came all the way from the Netherlands here to spew this poison, and we didn't try to stop him from talking. We just went and talked after him and said everything he said was nonsense. And guess what? Joe Crowley, proud Catholic, Irish Catholic person, stood right next to us and said, we agree with them two guys. And these haters who were at these mosques in Phoenix this last weekend, there was probably more Muslims there on the side of the Muslims to worship and pray freely than there were the guys with the M16s and the guns. So my point is, our neighbors don't hate us, right? As Muslims, we actually doing pretty good, and I think we hold a majority position when it comes to tolerance. And so, let me just say this though, Dr. Jones. My staff is looking at me like they're gonna jump up out of their skin if I don't leave right now. So I want to very respectfully and apologetically ask you to excuse me, and I want to say thank you for having me, and bless you and everybody, and we'll talk later, okay? Thank you.
I would just like to add something to that.
Can you all hear if they don't stand up?
Oh, I'll stand up. I just would like to say one more little fill-up to answer your question. One of the things we read, and it's confusing, because one of the things our opponents say is we're being forced to participate in a wedding, as if selling a cake or renting a tux is participate, and that's a real slippery slope. So is it the limo driver? I mean, so that's, really confusing. That's not participating in a wedding. And the other thing they do is is to say things that aren't true, which is to say, if a clergy person refuses to perform a wedding, they'll be fined or go to prison. Now, that's not true. So that exemption is really strong. So no clergy will ever have to perform a wedding if it's an interfaith wedding that they object to, if it's somebody's too old and somebody's too, they don't have to give a reason. It's like, that's what religious freedom is, but that's houses of worship, that's different. So it's always important to, say, when they say participate, what are they talking about, the clergy or the cake? And it's really different.
And can I just add one other piece to that? So the government has a compelling interest to make sure that kind of non-discriminatory actions don't enter into kind of the public sphere. And so it's something that we've seen traditionally in our civil rights legislation. And we also see some of these same tenets in like even the original RFRAs, right? And so what we're seeing now is kind of a perversion of the government's compelling interest to protect the rights of, in this case, religious minorities or others based on their beliefs. And I think it's important to talk about the government has the right and it always has sought to find the balance between how you protect and the compelling interests of making sure that we can respect someone's beliefs, but also how we're protecting the rights of others. And most of the time in this country, we haven't always done the best when we talk about others. And we historically have seen the kind of otherization of different categories, whether it was people of color or women or religious minorities. And so it's a tension that we constantly kind of go through. And now we particularly see that playing out when we're talking about our LGBTQ brothers and sisters.
Well, another, it's like I'm back in Toastmasters, all right. Another question that arose during the whole RFRA debate was, if a person went to a baker and they wanted a particular cake made, maybe something that would be deemed offensive, maybe a phallic symbol or something like that, could that owner legally decline making the cake? And that's something that we've debated amongst each other in terms of our staff, but I think it's different when you talk about LGBTQ couples or African Americans or Latinos, because 50, 60 years ago, people still used a religious premise to deny African Americans, saying African Americans were the cursed seed of Ham and all kinds of mythologies that have been pervasive. And so even though you don't have the history of slavery attached to it, discrimination is still discrimination. And so the question becomes, for those of us who are faith-based and concerned about changing society, how can we speak out boldly while maintaining the tenets of our faith, but still denouncing discrimination? Because for me as a Muslim, if it's discrimination against LGBT today, it's Hindu tomorrow, it's Muslim again, it's black again, it's so on and so forth. And so for me, the standard is discrimination, and I'll let the scholars figure out the rest. But the scholars are a part of the problem, but that's another subject, except for you. I have to go. Thank you, everybody.
So we have time for a few more questions. Yes.
Talked about a lot of terms here today, from hate, bigotry, what does religious freedom mean, all of these different terms that have been thrown around. Can we give a little bit of definition to what those terms mean? Because obviously there are a lot of shades to the debate, whether from a religious perspective, the religion was also a founding movement and cornerstone of the abolition movement, starting with William Wilberforce over in the UK and then coming over here. So how do we balance all of these things? How do we define terms? And how do we do that maybe in light of a variety of different positions and perspectives that are here in this country?
So I think religious pluralism is, again, it's something for us to be really proud of in this country. And I think we have to look at other countries where women are fired for wearing hijabs. And we just don't do that in this country. And different religions live side by side. But what that means is respect. For other faiths, and and some of that's not anything the government can do. Sometimes that's just being a good citizen. I also want to say that I think we all need to be careful in our language. That I think, and again, this is strategic, and I think this is just good common sense. If we completely demonize and villainize our opponents, everyday Americans are just going to close their ears and say, oh, here's another partisan fight between these people. I've got enough to do with my life. I don't really care about this. So strategically, it's important. But I also think it's true. I think that what we're seeing are the sort of tectonic plates really shift culturally. And there are a lot of people who are not bigots. They're just kind of confused, and they're just uncertain. And so as people see religion become less important in Americans' public life, in sort of a visual way, some people feel mocked for being religious. They feel like, people make fun of them for their faith, and they're just not sure about what all this stuff is. And so I think in terms of, and it used to be that everybody kind of agreed, well, premarital sex is wrong, and being gay is wrong, and getting divorced is wrong. And our moral imagination has really moved from that in terms of the majority of the country, but a lot of people are kind of uncertain about that. And so I think in terms of people within communities, it's very important, David Gushee and others. But I also think we have to be really careful that we don't demonize. And at the same time, there are really organized, well-funded forces trying to do, so not being naive about it, because, this is a really well-funded, well-organized opposition. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of people in the middle who just are not villains.
From a policy perspective, then, how do we take that to defining terms? How do we define what is discrimination, what is not? There were a lot of terms that we hear a lot, but I rarely hear any structure given to that. And we're in an environment where structure is part of the job, so to speak. Do you want to take?
So there are a few things that just fundamentally on the book, so to speak, we have said as a country, there is this recognition between your right to worship and practice your beliefs. And at the same time, there is a right to make sure that your beliefs don't intrude on the rights of others. And so these are kind of philosophical, but also kind of statutory canons that we have that is reflected in our jurisprudence. I think the concepts that you talk about, or that I think you're alluding to, when you hear words like discrimination, if some people in their beliefs don't feel like they're discriminating, are we using language that is too broad? And I think what's really important to do is to make the distinction between what the government is saying you can do and what the government is allowed to do, which is one of the reasons why we speak about kind of these state overly broad RFRAs. And I think it's important to also highlight, because the beginning and the origination of us moving forward with these state RFRAs were for the protection of religious minorities, because it was centered in recognizing that there were certain communities and certain faith and belief traditions that in this country we hadn't done a great job of protecting. And so as progressives, we cannot always say, oh, RFRAs are bad. What we have to say are these overly broad RFRAs that have a discriminatory intent, that are focused on trying to exclude certain communities, are bad. And why? Because in the public sphere, again, where you're talking about the vested interest between you and I, taxpayer dollars, there's a difference, and the government has a compelling interest to protect those interactions and to pay attention to what those interactions are between you and I. And so I want to just kind of harken back to something that Sally said. Progressives have to also reclaim language in religious moralistic, and value-laden terms. And I think it's important because what we have seen is that some of our opponents have taken the language, even saying like words like Constitution, like somehow progressives like don't like the Constitution. Now, when it was written, I was not included. I have a problem with that, but there are certain constitutional values that extend to all of us that even our founders didn't recognize. And so I don't cede the language of faith or value or morals or constitution or religion, because it is much as a part of me than it is some of my kind of conservative foes, so to speak. And so it's important that kind of we also use this language so that it isn't in this kind of dichotomy between you're good and you're bad.
So I'll just make a couple of quick points. I think, one, we could look at some of the state non-discrimination laws as guidance for what we could do on a national level in this regard. That's just straight from a sort of public policy point of view. I could say more about that, but for the sake of time, I won't. The second point I'd make is that for those people of faith, you can look within the traditions for those streams of progressive thought that have been there for centuries, which is how we got the abolitionist movement in Christianity. We have a Muslim professor at Union, Jerusha Lamptey, who teaches Islam in ministry. And she says, and I'm not an expert in Islam, but she says that there are streams of expanded and progressive thought within Islam that you can look to and find within the tradition itself a support for progressive stance on an inclusive society where people get to exercise their rights and their freedoms. So I would say that, one, we should look at state laws that have been established, these non-discrimination laws, as guidance for what we should do at the national level. And two, look within the traditions themselves, the centuries of thought and wisdom that can inform where we are now. What we've done, unfortunately, is elevated a few texts within Bibles and other places, and we've allowed those texts to guide everything, sort of a lazy way of dealing with these very complicated issues. And if we exercise a little determination to dive within those texts themselves, I think we could find within them the traditions that would support a more progressive and inclusive society. And we don't tend to do that. We've elevated, we've almost made sacred things that really aren't, that are actually contradicted within Scripture themselves, but we don't tend to do that. That's the kind of work we need to do, I think.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan as sort of some states to look out for. Is that where you see the next sort of RFRAs popping up, or I was wondering if anyone could comment on that?
Yeah, I know. I'm a little less sure. I'm a little less sure about Michigan, but Georgia and North Carolina. I know that the legislators in Georgia have said they'll be back, and I think the Georgia RFRA passed the Senate, and I think in Georgia you don't have to go back to zero. So when it comes back in 2016, it will just have to pass one house. And in North Carolina, they've said the same thing. I think that everybody was, and I think the reason, those two states slowed down was they saw the business impact and the big outcry for Indiana. And I think they have learned their lesson. And I think what a number of conservative legislators have said they will do is we'll just pass the federal RFRA, which is what Arkansas did. We'll just copy that and use that exact language. You have a RFRA, why can't we have one? And the problem with that, again, in a pre-Hobby Lobby world, that would not have been problematic because for-profit corporations didn't have religious liberty. You had to really prove a substantial burden that you're, you really threaded the needle in a kind of careful way. But but given how the Supreme Court interpreted RFRA, that becomes problematic. And one thing I would just like to say is some of us in this room, I see Ian Thompson from the ACLU and some others, we've been working on legislative language that will sort of hopefully tweak the federal RFRA. We call it the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So in other words, restoring it to what it was originally intended, and really sort of spelling out, not limiting the free exercise, but talking about third-party harm, which is what a lot of us talked about this morning. So that if you want an exemption and it causes non-trivial harm to somebody else, it's coercive to somebody else, that actually violates the Establishment Clause, because you're really not allowed, you can't impose your belief on somebody else legally. And so who knows what's going to happen with that. We're still in the original stages of that, but that at least shows another way of, being in support of RFRA. And without the harm. And just one other quick thing, I think Texas has a RFRA that people, they're tweaking it and they're trying to make it, take away some of the good stuff. But it's a RFRA that has a non-discrimination clause in it. So it's free exercise, but it does have that non-discrimination clause, which is fine.
One more burning question? All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. We're going to be blessed with a closing prayer from Representative Ellison, but he's had to leave, so he can't do that. So I am going to, in his stead, because we are a seminary, we claim that space proudly, ask you all to join me in prayer. Most gracious Creator of all that exists and is, in its vastness and wonder, we give you thanks for this day, for the lives gathered here, for the vast lives that surround us in our nation and our world. And we ask for strength and wisdom and open hearts and strong wills, that we continue together to create a community that reflects the highest human and divine aspirations that we hold dear. Amen. Amen. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you again.